So now we're outputting data and using methods on our Vue instance. I think it's a good time to introduce you to the idea of data binding. Now to do this, I want to walk you through a simple example. So imagine we want to output a link on our template. Now the href attribute on this link is going to be dynamic, controlled by our Vue instance. We don't just want to hard code it. So first of all, let's create a data property. We'll call this URL. Set it equal to a string, which is going to be youtube.com. So let's save that. And now what we want to do is take this URL property on the data and we want to output it into the href attribute of a link. So let's try this. We'll do an a tag and set the href attribute to this property. Now when we previously did this, when we output data, we use these double curly braces. So why not? Let's try this again. Double curly braces, URL, close them. And we'll place something inside the link tag, so YouTube, save that. And if we view it in the browser, there's the link. If we inspect the element, however, we see that the href attribute is just double curly braces, URL. Now obviously we don't want this, we want to dynamically output that URL property. So what's going on? Why is Vue not updating this like it did with the other properties here? Well, the reason is that any HTML attribute like href or value or class, they all expect a string value. So HTML is running here and looking at this and thinking this is the string value that we want to insert into this href attribute. Literally this. Now we have to kind of override that behavior. We need to say, look, Vue, when you see this link right here, I want you to bind our data from our Vue instance to this attribute. So we need to tell it to do that. And the way we can do that is very, very simply. We can just say v-bind, then the attribute we want to bind data to, then we can output the actual data. So we can take away these curly braces. We don't need these anymore because we're now telling Vue that we're binding some data to this attribute. So it doesn't need the curly braces to know that anymore. So we can use this v-bind because obviously we've loaded in the Vue library at the top. So this is known as a directive, and there's tons of different directives in Vue.js where we can add them to different HTML elements which kind of extend their functionality. And that's what this is doing, is kind of extending the functionality of the HTML element because we're now dynamically binding data to an attribute here. Okay? So let's save this and run it. And now if we inspect the element again, we can see that the URL has been inserted into the href attribute. Cool. So let's do another example. Let's now create a div, and this is just going to say classes from instance, and we're going to set the class equal to something. So now we want the value of the class attribute here to be dynamic as well. So again, we can bind data to this class attribute. We can say v-bind, then class, then we can output whatever data we want here. Now we need to make this data, so let's do another property and we'll call this classes. And this will be an array. We'll say 1 and 2. So these are going to be the class names 1 and 2. So let's save that, and now let's go to output these here. So we'll say classes. So again, when Vue.js runs this, it's going to see this v-bind directive now and say, okay, I know that you want to bind some data to the class attribute now, and that data is going to be the class's data property. So I'll look for that, I'll find it, I'll get that value, and I'll insert it right here. So let's save it and view it in a browser. And if we inspect this element now, we can see that it has the classes 1 and 2. Cool. So even though this thing right here was an array, it knows to take those two elements and insert them next to each other right here. Now let's just style these up to make sure it works. So I'll do a style tag at the top, then I'll do 1 first of all, give this a color of green, and then I'll also do 2, and this will have a text decoration property set to line through. So if we save that and view it in a browser, now we can see those styles because we have these classes and we're styling them up. All right, so let's do one more example. Let's create an input field, and let's give this input field a value and set that equal to hello for now. Now the value attribute here basically inserts the content into that input field. So if we save it and view it in a browser, we can see that hello is inside the input field. Now let's dynamically bind some data to this attribute as well. So we'll say v-bind, bind it to the value, and this time let's bind it to the name property, which we already have on our Vue instance. It's Ryu. So let's save that, check it out in a browser, and now we see this inside the input box as well. Okay. So there we go, that's how we bind data to these different HTML attributes so we can dynamically inject content into them. All right. Now, because vbind right here is being used all the time in applications, the Vue team decided to come up with a shortcut for it. So instead of writing vbind and then colon and then the attribute all the time, we can just write colon and then the attribute. And this does exactly the same. It's going to bind data to that attribute. All right, so let's save this and make sure it still works, and everything does still work. So this is the way I'm going to be using vbind as we go forward through this course, but you can feel free to use whichever way that you prefer.